Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. Please note that audio will broadcast through your computer speakers and is reliant on your internet connection. I will be adding dial-in information to the chat window in case anyone does need to call in for audio on today's program. At the request of our speaker, handouts are going to be provided at the conclusion of today's webinar, so keep an eye on your email for that. And we recommend that you keep your viewing option on the side-by-side mode today so that you can see our speaker and the full presentation. You can submit questions at any point through today's webinar by typing those into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be handling those predominantly at the end of today's program. So today's Association for Learning Environments webinar is called Reopening Schools, When and How, Factors to Consider in the Midst of COVID-19. Today we're going to welcome back Prakash Nair as our speaker. He is a world-renowned architect, futurist, and the founding president and CEO of Education Design International. We have a lot of material to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and hand things off to Prakash, and thank you again for joining us for today's program.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here. I heard that as many as 350 people had signed up, which means there's a lot of interest in this subject, as I was expecting. But I think that I want to start by saying that we are in very, very difficult times. I think it's unprecedented what we are going through. And so when we step back, we can look at this problem of reopening schools or any other problem that we face today with hunkering down mode, let's just survive, let's get through this. Or we can look at it from the perspective of what can we do to find good solutions that we actually come out of this better and stronger. And I hope that by the time we're done with this webinar, you'll see that my focus certainly is to bring us out of this better and stronger. So that would be the ultimate purpose of this. With that, I'm going to share my presentation and then we'll take it from there. So I want to just start by thanking my colleague, Roni Zimmer-Doktori, who was very instrumental in helping me put this presentation together. She's our chief architect in Israel. And as you know, Israel is one of the countries that actually open schools. So we have some perspective from there as well. So thank you, Roni. And while I'm acknowledging people, I want to acknowledge Louis, who's our director of design, and as well as Adil, who's our director of communications. This is an A4LE course program, and so I want to thank Janelle and her team for putting it together at fairly short notice. It's also an AIA CES program, and so you will obviously get credit, and I'm putting this up because I'm supposed to, I'm required to. As far as the learning objectives, you got the detailed version when you signed up. Really, I think that the focus here should be on converting all of this into an opportunity, and talk a little bit more about that as well. So I just want a quick survey to find out your affiliation, your government, private sector, or somebody at some other group. So there's your survey. Just quickly fill it out and that'll help me modulate my comments accordingly. Well, it's 68% private sector, for 22% government sector, 9% other. That's interesting because 22% is actually a pretty significant number, because normally on these A4LEs, it's much more private sector. So I'm glad to see that there are some people from the government who obviously, to whom this is a very important subject. So I will definitely put that as my key, I'll be thinking about that as we go through this. And of course, I think I want to start by saying, let's face the reality, the elephant in the room, which is that COVID isn't going away anytime soon. We're looking at 18 months, 24 months, at least from the perspective of schools and schooling, the idea that we just need to do a quick fix and everything will be back to normal. I think we need to get past that kind of thinking. It's not going to be back to normal, certainly not for a while, and I think the numbers, particularly from this country, are just proving that day in and day out. So before we go any further, I think it's important to sort of explain that Sugata Mitra had a very elegant definition of education. He said to be happy, to be healthy, to be useful. This is as simple as it gets. So whatever solutions we are looking at, we should reference it back to these three things. Are children happier? Are they healthy and are they useful? Of course, health is now the number one priority in everybody's mind, but that doesn't mean we should throw these other two things away. So we are focusing on two components here, logistics of reopening schools, and then using this as a sort of jumping off point to improve schooling. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why we need to improve schooling, but I think it's kind of self-evident. I think at least for a couple of decades, if not more, people have been talking about education reform. And now, guess what? We've had a kind of a catalyst that's going to push us firmly in that direction. So I just want to hear from my audience again to see, what are you here for? Are you here to hear about the logistics of school opening, or are you here also to listen to interesting ideas about how this whole thing be leveraged so that we are actually improving schooling? So I'm curious to see where your interest lies. Okay, so 57% to 44%. So, I mean, there's definitely an interest in the improving schooling part, but I'm not going to blow off the logistics part. I do want to tell you in advance that the first part isn't the most exciting, but I definitely make up for it in part two. But I do believe that we have to know what are the logistics of reopening schools. And what I've really done is try to be a curator, have pulled information from a variety of sources, which I'm going to share with you. I don't claim to be an expert on the sort of science, and that's why I'm listening to scientists, and I'm just going to bring all of that together. And since we're going to be distributing all of this material to you, you don't even need to take notes. If you can just listen and maybe write down some questions that you have, and then we'll talk about that. I hope to leave enough time at the end for Q&A. So I'm not going to really dwell too much on the CDC because, I mean, obviously CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is the first place you turn to in a crisis like this. But when it comes to schools and reopening schools, their guidelines are more generic. They don't really approach it from the perspective of education as being different from any other business. So I'm going to be giving you many other resources. And so what I'm asking you to do is, while the CDC is asking you to jump through a bunch of hoops before you can consider opening a school, I'd also ask you to look at these other resources that I'm going to be giving you before you make a final decision about whether to open and how to open schools. So when you look at all the chatter that's out there on the internet, all the different things that the various experts, and many of these are experts that became experts during the course of the last 2 months, so there's no real experts on the ground. And anybody who says they have all the answers, I can tell you they don't. I don't have all the answers, and neither does anybody, because this is constantly shifting ground that we are on. So there's these 6 approaches. Now, as I was writing down these 6 approaches, Education Week came up with a very well-written article that actually talks about the pros and cons, which made my life a little easier because all I have to do is share that resource with you, and we can then talk about this at a higher level. So let's quickly run through these 6 options. The first one is phased reopening. Phased reopening is actually pretty straightforward. It simply says, look, we know that come September or late August, we're not going to be ready. We need to open schools in a thoughtful way. And the way to do that is to bring only some students back, or we open the school for a couple of days, not all 5 days of the week. So this is, and then slowly we can build up and when we start becoming confident. The multi-track option basically says that we divide children into 2 groups or 3 groups, as the case may be, and they don't all come in on the same day. And the reason you do this is, of course, to reduce the number of children who are in school at any given time. So depending upon what's convenient for you, you use either the two-track option or the 3-track option. Staggered schedules is self-evident. School happens mornings and afternoons. The school day is not necessarily that extended. It just happens to be in the morning and afternoon, and then you're splitting it by grade level or alphabetically. If children in the same family might prefer the alphabetical approach. Then we have a bubble strategy, which is something that CDC is recommending, and I'm not crazy about this because it means that students who are in the same cohort will always stay together and the teachers cycle in and out. And for me, that means children will not be allowed to socialize or mingle with kids outside their cohort, which might be their class. I'm not sure why CDC recommends that. I certainly wouldn't advocate that. Cyclical lockdown simply means you go to school 1 week and then the school shuts down for 2 weeks, and then this pattern repeats itself. And the reason is, the science behind this is that this prevents an outbreak happening at the school, because children are out of school long enough to detect those who are sick, and then they can be quarantined. And the last one is a year-round school where kids are in school for 9 weeks at a time and then learn remotely 9 weeks. So groups just alternate between being in school and being remote. And in this scenario, you have to go year-round simply because there's just not enough days of the year that kids are in school. Going to get a lot of pushback from the summer camp community here, but since this is a relatively short-term problem that we're trying to solve, probably 2 summers, hopefully they'll play ball as well. Let's look at what's happening around the world. I'm just showing you some pictures from different parts of the world, what that reopening of schools might actually physically look like. And here are some images from Belgium. And I'm going to flip through these quickly. China. Since others have already done this, I think we can start to learn from that experience. Cyprus. And I'm curious how these kids will continue to maintain that social distance. You can see they're not wearing masks either, which is supposedly an important thing. But having young children wear masks, that's a whole different thing that we'll get into. France, Italy, Israel, Tunisia, United Kingdom. So I think when you see those pictures, it's fair to ask, and this is one teacher put it very well, masked peers that you must keep away from. Is that something that you want to tell young children to do? Discipline and punishments for hugging friends. Teachers now become policemen and policewomen, constantly managing and monitoring social distancing, daily temperature checks. It's fear, and that's going to be there. And the question ultimately is, what kind of an environment for learning are we creating with all of these preconditions to opening schools? And of course, then schools are going to close as well, multiple times. So this question of happy, healthy, useful comes into play. And we really have to ask the question, what is the ultimate purpose of school? I mean, are we so obsessed with the logistics that we forget the reason children are in school in the first place? So there's a whole category of children that have to be talked about differently, and that is the disadvantaged children and kids from underserved communities. For them, school is essential for a multiplicity of reasons, including the fact that it's very hard for them to avail of school lunches if they are not in school. Schools are the only place where they have access to high quality internet. There's increased chances of abuse when they are in homes where they don't have the same opportunities that other children have. And there are mental health issues, loneliness, depression, which, by the way, even children in upper income families have experienced, because we're not just talking about schools being shut down. Remember, we shut societies down, we shut parks down, we shut many opportunities for children to meet in malls and movie theaters. And so teenagers in particular are having a lot of angst as a result of all of this. Let's look at children. Now, again, this is a moving target. This is as of the date that I'm presenting today. This is what we know, that only about 2% of all the known cases are young children between, below the age of 19. And vast majority of them have moderate symptoms. I mean, it's not acceptable that any child should die from this. But good news is that it affects children a lot less than it affects adults. At least from the child's perspective, it's good news. And the parent's perspective, it's relatively good news. And the other thing that is interesting is that there's not that much documentation that children are passing this on to adults. It looks like it's the other way around, that most of the transmissions from adult to child. So we now have some research coming back from the countries that have opened. And the numbers are saying that there has been no immediate spike in new cases that can be directly attributed to schools opening, okay? Now, interestingly, the economies have reopened in many countries, and there have been direct correlations between reopening the economy and reopening and the increase in cases. It's clear because we opened the economy, but we didn't open schools. So that means you can see the spike has nothing to do with schools. And in those countries where schools did open, they were not able to find a direct correlation between increasing community spiking as connected to school reopening. Now, of course, one of the things that countries have to be prepared for, and Israel is a good example of this, as is France, that there will be school closures simply because somebody or the other is going to test positive. And when that happens, all the necessary precautions have to be taken. Schools have to remain closed until you can isolate the people who've had it, who they came in contact with. So that's another inevitable aspect of this whole crisis that we are dealing with. I also wanted to point out, I told you earlier, the CDC has some good guidelines, but the workplace coming up with some really good guidelines. This is their bottom line at risk here. So they're coming up with very good guidelines that take into account all the scientists' cautions. And I would say that schools really can take advantage of all the work that's being done in the private sector beyond public schools and government. And the other great place for information is private international schools. AAIE, which is the Organization of International Schools, has published a really great list of private international schools who have put together very good guidelines. I would say somewhat better, if not substantially better than CDC, simply because these are oriented specifically for schools. And again, I'm going to give you a laundry list of schools that you can refer to. So this is an American school, Embassy School in Delhi, that happens to be one of our clients. I'll even show you some pictures from them. And they put together a very good list. I'm just sharing a couple of pages out of their manual. And I definitely recommend that you look at their guidelines as well as various other international schools. So question of safety, how safe are schools, right? So there are 5 risk factors: inside, outside, proximity to others, exposure time, how likely is it that people are going to comply, and finally, risk level. Now, the inside outside thing, it's been clear all along that inside is more dangerous than outside. But guess what? Just as recently as a few days ago, studies have come back saying that the virus actually can be airborne and stay airborne in aerosolized particles, which are very fine grained particles, and they can stay up airborne for significant amounts of time, few hours at a time. And that even a 1 mile per hour wind can carry the virus up to 20 feet, right? And most cities in the United States have an average wind speed of 10 miles per hour. So the 5 or 6 feet social distancing may or may not be enough. So what I'm saying is this stuff, the ground is shifting from under our feet. So even as the entire world is getting ready for 6 feet proximity, who knows if that's going to be enough. So activities ranked by COVID risk levels. You can see here, there's a bunch of activities that are ranked here, and schools come in 7. And I'll tell you why. And I may not necessarily agree fully with the 7 grading. So it's among the high risk activities among all the things. Tennis, which I happen to like to play, is a 1. So don't feel guilty going out there and playing tennis. Takeout food in the same way is a 1. So here's the reason why schools are at a 7, because 4 of the 5 factors apply to schools. Mostly inside, kids are in proximity to each other all the time. They tend to be exposed for many hours of the day. And the likelihood of children complying is much less than adults. But here's the wild card. The personal risk level for children is substantially lower. And I mean substantially lower. We're talking about, orders of magnitude lower. So maybe that kind of balances out some of the other factors here. And so maybe schools shouldn't be at a 7. Maybe they should be a 5 or a 6. This is up for debate. I think this survey from USA Today is very helpful, because it allows schools and school districts to plan for the future, knowing what teachers and students are going to do. Now, here it is, 20% of teachers probably won't want to come back to school. This is something we need to keep in mind. 30% of students may not be there. So when we talk about bringing 100% of the students back, we're really talking about 70%, not 100%. 80% of teachers are overwhelmed by all of this. And whatever plan we make, we have to support teachers. They definitely need a lot of help. 60% of new teachers not ready for distance teaching. Not a surprise, because they weren't hired to do distance teaching, and suddenly they're thrown into this mix and said, wow, this is it. This is what you're supposed to do. Obviously not ready for it. And this is critical, because 20% of low-income students have very little access or no access to distance learning. So what happens? The very children that most need the help, extra help, are the ones that are going to be cut out of it. So whatever plans we are making, we have to figure out a way to get this up and running. And 20% is a lot, but at the same time, it's not 80%. So I feel like it's a solvable problem. And hopefully business and government and various public and private sector people can come together to solve this problem. So in the end, when we talk about school reopening, it's a complex decision, right? First, we have to look at the prevailing numbers. Then we have to be prepared to close at a moment's notice. We have to clearly communicate all the risks to all our stakeholders. And then we have to have those mitigation measures, of which there are umpteen, and those continue to get updated. And so schools need to keep up with that. So when you put all of this together, and then there's this wild card, costs. I mean, apparently around the nation, at last count, we're talking about $41 billion in additional costs just to reopen schools. And many states are losing money precisely at the time that they need more money. So if California schools lose $19 billion in funding. So the question ultimately might come down to, can you afford it? And if you can, what level of reopening can you actually afford? So there's a multiplicity of factors that need to be considered before you can make that decision. And then you will decide based upon all the various options that I'm presenting to you. Now, time to take a deep breath. I promised you I'll get to that first part. And as I said, a lot of the stuff that I presented to you is actually available online, and as well as the curated materials I'm going to give you. So I'm not sort of abrogating my responsibilities in that area. So, but now we get to what I think the interesting part of this webinar, which is what do we do, right? So Wayne Gretzky's very old and almost cliche-like quote, skate to where the puck is going, not where it has been. It's relevant for me to mention this because the reality is that most of the time when we plan schools, we are planning it for our past and not for our children's future. So it's time now to really pay attention to this quote to say, are we really going to where the puck is going? Because where the puck is going is a very, very, very different place than where it's been in the past. And the reason for that is the fourth industrial revolution. We are right in the thick of it. It's not coming tomorrow. It's not coming 5 years from now. It's already here. And the world into which our children will graduate the next 10, 15, 20 years is going to dramatically alter. And the idea that we're going to create schools and go back to business as usual makes no sense. We've now got a tremendous wake-up call. Something that we couldn't have done before, we might be able to do because of COVID. And so horrible as it is, it could become an amazing opportunity for schools to completely look different. And the United States can take a leadership role here. Look, the US has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the COVID cases. This is not the area in which the US should be leading. USA should be leading in terms of solutions, good solutions that the rest of the world can also adopt. So this is the old model, exclusive private schools, sending kids off to great colleges. This model is dead. And the reason is this. I mean, my son was going to a school, he just graduated, and it was called a prep school. What's prep? Preparing for college. Guess what? Colleges are becoming obsolete right before our very eyes. Very innovative companies, the most innovative companies in the world say we don't need college. But they need something, right? What do they need? What they need are qualifications that show their students that their employees can actually do the work that they're being hired to do. So we have all these online options. I was talking to Matt, who is running this webinar, and he said their business has gone up significantly because the online world is suddenly being recognized for all its potential. So even when it comes to places like libraries, they are becoming obsolete in many ways. That is a physical library, at least on the temporary basis. Companies like Hoopla and others are actually taking over and replacing physical libraries. So going back to the basics here, there are really two types of education, right? We have teacher-centered learning and student-centered learning. We have to understand what is it that we are going back to, right? When we say, let's go back to normal, what are we going back to, right? So over the past 2 decades or so, maybe even 3 decades, slowly and steadily student-centered learning has been making inroads. Our business, the work that we do for the past 20 years, is almost exclusively focused on student-centered learning. So this is a viable business, viable industry, but it's still been a fringe movement, at least in the world of education. So what's unfortunately happened during COVID is that student-centered learning has taken a backseat. And now if you saw the pictures that I shared with you, it's all about teacher direction. So the few gains we have been lost, but the question is, have they? Do they have to be lost? And my answer is, it's very early in the game. There's absolutely no reason why we cannot design the future in such a way that we restore, in fact, go beyond restoring, go to the whole new level of what we call teacher-centered learning, student-centered learning. And so in order to do that, we have to make sure that 4 components of student-centered learning happen. And you'll see why the online world is perfect for this, right? Personalized learning means every student is treated like an individual, not as part of a group. So right off the bat, you can do that better in the online world than you can do in a classroom where you're sitting with 25, 30 other students. It's almost impossible to personalize learning in a classroom. Competency-based simply means that every student has to master whatever that they're supposed to be learning before they move on. If you're sitting in class for 45 minutes or 50 minutes with your friends, chances are a lot of you haven't mastered it, and yet you're socially promoted to the next level, right? Anytime, anywhere is again not compatible with classrooms because it's time and space bound. And finally, student-owned simply means every child has some say in what they learn, who they learn with, where they learn, and how they learn, which of course is impossible if you try to do that with 25 or 30 students in a classroom. So basically, the classroom model of education is incompatible with student-centered learning, no matter how much the rhetoric is out there. And a lot of this has to do with a physical school. And that's why I want to talk about that, to let, not to say that teachers aren't trying valiantly, which they are, but I think they're trying, fighting a failing battle because the school buildings and the facilities and the environments that we have created simply are not conducive to student-centered learning. So look at this. How do you do student-centered learning? And even more so in the midst of a pandemic, it's impossible. So what now? Where do we go from here? That's the big question, right? So the answer to that is, let's start by being very honest about this. Let's stop romanticizing schools and classrooms. These places are not something that we should be hankering for, like, oh, wow, I wish we could go back to that. Why? These are prisons. I mean, and I'm not blaming the educators here. I think all of us as architects, we have a responsibility to this. I know many of us are stuck with the standards, but if we got schools and communities to recognize that those are ancient standards built for yesterday's world, I think we can actually encourage our schools to go beyond those standards and develop new ways of designing schools. So this isn't it, guys. This is not the way to do education. This is an image that would have been okay in 1950. It's absolutely not okay today. And as I said again, we now have a reason because we can't do this, right? So if we can't do this, maybe we can do something else, and not the pictures that I showed you with kids in mass sitting 7 feet away from everybody else. So again, let's give up on this. I've always been saying, let's give up on this. In fact, I wrote a piece in Education Week saying the classroom is obsolete. But as I said, it's very, very difficult to change existing cultures, existing organizations. I mean, education is a massive industry, and the classroom is at the absolute foundation of that whole industry. So how can you destroy the foundation? Because the whole establishment would come crumbling down. And what I'm saying is it doesn't have to. And today, we now have a way to redesign education in a way that it doesn't, you're not using the classroom as your building block anymore. And believe me, I'm showing you pictures from some very, very high performing schools in some very high end school districts and private schools as well. So this isn't it's something that is limited to a poorer community, so to speak. So here it is. This model hasn't changed. I mean, one could argue the model started in the 1800s, like 1875. So look, is there any other industry that you can get away by doing things the way you did it in 1900 or 1875? No. Why are we getting away with it in education? And education of all industries needs to be future focused. And if anything, it's the opposite. Education, unfortunately, is looking backward. And again, largely because of the way the physical school building almost forces us to do that. So here's what I'm going to talk about: the next 12 to 18 months. And then after that, what happens? So we have 2 pieces of the puzzle that we now have to fill in. I've already given you the 6 alternatives, which I think may be the beginning of the conversation, but it's definitely not. If those 6 were the only options you have, I would say we're done for, because they're not going to give you what you're looking for here. So let's see if we can come up with a 7th option. So the 7th option is actually, we realize that physical school becomes part-time, right? We've all acknowledged that. When you look at those 6 different ways of doing it, we're all saying, look, you can't bring back an entire school community. Plus, as I said, many of them aren't coming back anyway. So we live with that reality for the next 12 months, 18 months, whatever that time frame might be. And then we look at the online world and say, okay, are we really taking advantage of the online world? And the answer is no. For the most part, from my own son's experience and from everybody else I've seen, some attempts have been made, and I'm not blaming anyone, because thrown into this in a matter of weeks, if not months, and it is impossible to completely redesign. So for the most part, what schools have done, they've taken what they did in school and they've just transferred it to the online world, and that's horrible. So what I'm saying is there should be absolutely no duplication in the online world of what you're doing in school. That's the first thing. If you're duplicating it, drop it, right? And there doesn't have to be synchronous, meaning that teachers and students don't have it together all the time. Sugata Mitra again talked about self-organized learning environments. We have to teach students the right questions, and they will dig up the answers. They'll talk to each other, they'll work with each other, socialize with each other, even if it's distance learning, and come up with answers. It has to be personalized, which is very, very possible to do in an online world. Parents have to be critical partners here. So that's an amazing opportunity for us to make parents our partners in this process. Mental health, absolutely an amazing, wonderful resource to bring mental health professionals into the equation and make them partners in education. Hey, virtual lessons, kids would love to be taught guitar or piano, whatever it is that they are interested in. I, as an architect, would happily spend time working with schools to help them understand what architecture is and give them assignments that they'll actually do because they'll be engaged and excited to do it. They could have mentors from all over the world. Why are schools limiting themselves to only the teachers that work there? And hey, what about schools talking to each other? If you're trapped in a classroom as a teacher, the chances are you're not talking to the school down the block or down the other part of the neighborhood or another part of the city. Here's an opportunity for schools who are like-minded to start to partner. And finally, bring industry into the picture. We're online anyway. Why not have them offer some skills, particularly for the high school and middle school years, that kids can actually use immediately, become entrepreneurs, work in industry, work in technology. There's so many things that kids can do if partnered with the right people. So this blended approach actually would work, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But the bottom line here is we've not even started to scratch the surface of all these online learning opportunities. There's so many of them out there. It's an absolutely gold mine of teaching and learning resources. So the reason why it's not working right now is because school buildings and school as an organization, as an institution, is based on the hierarchical model where some group of adults have decided what our children should learn in second grade and third grade and fifth grade and ninth grade. We built a curriculum, and then we're just mindlessly forcing children to go through that curriculum, regardless of whether a kid wants to be a rocket scientist or a gardener. They're all being put through the same mill. And what we're saying is in this hierarchical model, children are powerless. They have almost no say. And what we're saying is the minute you get out of school, the moment you get out of school, you're in an open network. I mean, today you can connect with people, you can connect with resources, you can connect with expertise of all kinds, like-minded people in the other end of the world, whether you want to play chess or some video game. And so children are in this networked world. And when they walk into school, it's walking into a time machine. I mean, it's like they are being asked to go back 50 years into the past, which to us is fine because this was our world, but this is not their world. So what I'm saying is that this arrow makes no sense to take the horrible kind of backward hierarchical model and try to force it into the online world, which doesn't work that way, which is one of the reasons why there's so much disconnection from students, because they just don't want to do in the online world what they were doing in school. So what I'm saying is, what if we were to reverse that arrow? What if instead of going toward the right, what if it were going toward the left? Imagine what school could be like if it actually became a network. So I'm saying that this system could work with the physical school and the online school if the model where that the physical school became a network model, and the online world, of course, we don't have to do anything with because it's already a network model. So in this model, I'm calling it the right way. I'm dispensing with the numbers. We did 7, right? So I'm saying there is a right way to do this. And the right way to do this is to say, okay, we'll stick with all the other stuff in the blended model that I showed you. And by the way, you could add 5 more boxes to it comfortably. I've just put the most obvious ones here. But here in this model, the physical school becomes repurposed because, as I said, you want to go back to the network model in the physical school. And to do that, you have to repurpose it. And I'm not talking about spending huge amounts of money. I'm talking about a long-term plan that you can approach in a very considered manner. Schools and school districts are spending billions of dollars across the nation on renovations, new construction, maintenance. And I'm saying, let's direct those monies so that it goes toward the things that we wanted to go toward. So this is a model that we need to dispense with. This is not what physical school should look like. Look, teachers are not interior designers. I don't think there's a course in the education world in which to become a teacher, you're supposed to prove your interior design chops. I don't think so. And so we end up with places like this. Would you want to spend your day in a room that looks like this? I'm just saying that this is not acceptable, and we should make this unacceptable. And this is not a knock on teachers, right? Because they're doing their best. They're doing what they think is absolutely the best thing. But the research from the world of environmental science, neurology, and all these scientific places which talk about student development said this is exactly the opposite of what they should be. So think about this space. This is an atelier at one of our schools. An atelier is a studio. Now, if you look at it and compare it with this space, I'm going back to this, an atelier allows you to do a multiplicity of things. Think about all the things you can do here. Can you put a label on this? Is it an art room? Maybe, maybe not. Is it a place for humanities? A place to talk about, philosophy? Is it a place to play music? Is it a place to write or read or be quiet or put on a little play, and on and on and on. So what we're saying is these ateliers should replace typical classrooms so that they become multifunction spaces that can allow you to do a whole bunch of different things. And we're not wanting to put a label on it and say, this is what this is for. By the way, this idea came from Reggio Emilia, who initiated the idea of ateliers instead of traditional schools and classrooms. And we've been doing this successfully in schools around the world. So in order to go from the classroom model, we have to have an alternative model. And we've been doing this model now for over 20 years. So I know it works. We have tons of evidence from all parts of the world, including the United States, by the way, where we worked in school districts across the country, that we can take existing schools and convert them to learning communities. So on the left is what you call the traditional school with a teacher at the front of the classroom. And you can see the top is the hardware and the bottom is the software of education. And yes, you can do a 20th century, even 19th century education there, but definitely not a 21st century education. The learning community takes the same amount of spaces. These are just diagrams. These are not floor plans. And by combining teachers to work together in a teacher suite, you end up creating opportunities to do the kinds of learning, to create the network model that I talked about that you absolutely couldn't do in the old model. And I'm not dispensing with direct instruction, by the way. You can teach directly. You can lecture if that's what you want to do. But you don't have to always lecture to 25 students at the same time. You can meet with them 1s and 2s and 5s and on and on. So I'm going to show you some pictures because I think it's most powerful to actually see images. So this is a before picture of a school, and this is what it might look like. And in fact, it is actually a conversion of that space. And here's a before picture, computer labs. Obsolete. Why do we need computer labs? I mean, this particular school has an iPad for every student as well as a MacBook. So why do they need a computer lab? It makes absolutely no sense. And you can see the teacher sitting forlorn in front of the room. So over a period of a few weeks, we converted this into an iLab, an innovation lab. As you can see, very student directed. Those 4 components of student direction can all happen here. Libraries in their old format, not necessary anymore. We don't need to have libraries that look like this. We call them curiosity centers now, where the library is a place for children to figure things out, learn as they want to, use the tools that they need to. And so our libraries have been repurposed as curiosity centers. In fact, the picture that you see behind me is a public school where behind is a curiosity center. The front is the welcoming entry. We call it the family room with a fireplace. So here's that same library repurposed as a learning community. And here's hallways that can be repurposed to actually do something. This is, again, part of an old library, repurposed. This is, again, I'm telling you, some of these are from very high-paying, exclusive private schools. And you can see how that space, over the course of a few weeks, was transformed. We worked with them and we came up with a learning community. This is a before picture. This is an after picture. These are, of course, some after pictures of spaces. I don't need to show all the before pictures. We all know what they look like. Again, some after pictures. And so what I'm talking about applies to children of all ages. This isn't something that applies only to older or younger kids. Now, here's a great image. you can't do this in the online world, right? So when kids come to school, we want them to be doing things that they just couldn't do online. So there's an actual reason to bring them back to school, not so that we can be their custodians and let the parents work. So we grab them and put them there with their face masks and force them to social distance. That's not the reason for school. Schools have to provide things to students that they absolutely couldn't have gotten if they were sitting at home. So here are more images for what our schools look like. So this I'm showing you because this actually was a very successful public school in Florida. And I wanted to say that, and Florida doesn't have very big budgets for public school construction. So this, with very limited budget, we created for that same school, we created this environment and this environment and this environment. So again, I don't think people should use budget as a reason that we can't do it, specifically in the United States, where school construction budgets are actually very generous. This is in Vancouver. By the way, Canada has a very, very tight government budget for schools and much, much less money than the US spends. And we were able to do it there. And in that particular school, the teachers work as a team. And this is an amazing thing. Once teachers start working together, it changes everything. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind. And this is actually a private school in Canada, but again, you can see all the student displays that are there, and students take ownership of these buildings as well. Again, where are the no classrooms, no corridors? It all looks very different. There's a garage door in the back there, which is a maker space. Places for children to do things. Again, as I said, be in social groupings that wouldn't be possible in the typical classroom model. Again, this is public school, Colorado. This is what a non-classroom type environment might look like. We talked about personalization. This is what it looks like. This is a high school that we renovated in Colorado again, and you can see where's the teacher. I mean, children and students of all ages will self-organize. Going back to Sugata Mitra's self-organized learning environments, you give them the appropriate environments and you'll be shocked how easily they self-organize. So you don't have to make this a tough job of trying to force and coerce kids to do well, so, and give them these fake things like stickers and marks on an exam. You don't have to do that. I mean, motivated students will learn. These are all student-led exercises I'm showing you in the various spaces that we've renovated around the world. This happens to be in Michigan. This is in Brussels, in Belgium. This, again, back to Michigan. Again, in these pictures, you don't see too many teachers because the teachers are off doing their own thing, getting ready for the next assignment. As I said, a good teacher's job is to ask the right questions and let students find the answers. So we get pushback, of course, and I'm sure many of you have questions on this. How does this work? How do you know it's going to work? What kind of proof do you have? So we've had to create measures of success. So we've actually made this very simple. We've created apps that allow you to literally measure the efficacy of a school design even before it's constructed. And then after it's constructed, make sure that that design is working the way it was intended to. So on the architecture side, we have an app that is very easy to use, literally takes a few seconds to use it on a daily basis. And on the teaching side, we also have an app where teachers can reference this to see if they're taking full advantage of the spaces that was designed. So that app is called the Path app. So what I'm saying is that it's not enough for us to just tell schools that this works. We have to then give them the tools that they can use on a daily basis. Now, we are really excited about the new app that we are creating, which is right now in production. My colleague, Louis, who's our director of design, is actually leading this process. And essentially, this is something where the school building becomes like a Google Maps. And you can just drop these pins anywhere in the school. And behind the pin is all the data relating to that school, that particular space. It could be the enrollment, it could be capacity, it could be all the various modalities of learning that that particular space can be good for. So this can be used for scheduling. It can be used for programming different activities so that teachers can now really plan their curriculum in a way that students are engaging in the kind of learning modalities that they would otherwise not be able to do in a classroom. And also, as I said, it's an amazing scheduling app, and it gives the administrators a way to know whether or not the building is actually being used. All that money that you spend on the building, are we using it properly, right? So that's another important way to use this. So we're very excited. This should be out in another 2 or 3 months from now. And so we're excited to kind of bring this out into the education world. And as I said, it's available for both Apple and Android platforms, and very, very easy to use. And I actually think students will be using this as much as anybody else. Now I want to end with this very interesting sort of analysis. Now you see here 20 modalities of learning. Now these are the kinds of things, activities that we want students to be engaged in while they're in the physical school, and in many ways also in the online school, right? So what we did is looked at the classroom and saw how many of these modes of learning is the classroom optimized for from a design standpoint. You saw the pictures I showed you of the classroom. So it's optimized for basically 3 modalities of learning and kind of for the 4th one, right? It's only giving it a half point. But I had to discount that because of the engagement factor. In other words, it's very hard to keep 25 or 30 students engaged when they're all trying to do the same thing at the same time. So I've taken off some points for lack of engagement at the bottom. Now, if you look at the online classroom, you can do a little bit more, like independent studies, slightly easier to do in the online. You can see I've not given full marks here, and there are reasons for that. Because how do we know a student is studying independently? Maybe they're off doing something completely unrelated to the assignment we gave them, right? So it's not easy to monitor. So given them only half a point there. But when you add up the modalities, you can see the minute you go online, you increase your opportunities. But guess what? I discounted the online classroom by 3 points because I said, it's not going to work if your students aren't there and sitting in front of the computer. And if they don't want to sit there, they won't. And if you're going to give them the same stuff that you gave them in the physical classroom, chances are they're going to be gone. I mean, a student actually put up something on their Zoom window, said reconnecting. That was an image. They went off to do their own thing. So students will come up with lots of creative ways. So I've actually discounted the online classroom even more. But even with that, the online. So if you were choosing just between physical classroom and online classroom, the online classroom ekes out a narrow victory with 2.5. The blended model that I showed you, the option 7, actually does pretty well. And this requires no expenditure of construction money whatsoever. And you can see just by taking complete and full advantage of the internet, you can move this all the way up to 10.5. And this is something we can start doing now. Weeks from now, months from now, we can actually have a blended model going. Even with all the limitations of COVID, we can still create an amazing blended model that will give you a score of 10.5. Now, the hybrid model, that does require some expenditure of school construction money. And as I said, we are spending the money anyway. Let's do it right. That model actually comes in at a 19, right? So think about this. We do have a choice. We can stick with the classroom. Hey, but we can't even go back to that until 2022. So do we want to go back to an education system that gives us a score of 1.5 from the perspective of how well it accommodates student learning? Do we want to go to this model that we're currently in, which is take the classroom online for a marginal improvement to get 2.5? Do we want to go to a blended model that really takes advantage? So we need experts, of course, advising schools about how to take advantage of this. So they might need to hire a special person whose job is to create these blended curriculums. And that's a 10.5, right? And then of course, the hybrid model that I'm talking about, which is somewhat longer term, that's what you want to see the minute you come out of the COVID crisis, which I'm sure we will, right? I mean, humanity is putting their entire energy behind it. So of course, we're going to come out of this. And that's a 19. So to me, it's a no-brainer. Now, we've been pushing this 19 model for the last 20 years, so we know it works. And I'm just saying now the time is right for the rest of the world to wake up and say, hey, I want in. So this is going to be the last slide of this presentation. So I want to conclude the American Institute of Architects portion of this talk. We're going to take questions. I hope there'll be good ones. But before that, so that I'm allowed to talk a little bit about who we are, and I'll spend just a minute on it. Our firm is called Education Design International, and my colleagues and I have been doing this for 20 years now in 52 countries. So obviously something is working. We've written dozens of articles. We have 3 books, 2 of them in collaboration with Harvard University. We won 2 A4LE McConnell Awards. And I'm just trying to put this out there to say we're not out there in left field. We're very much mainstream. And the key here is we partner with local architects. And I know there are a lot of architects in this audience who are actually not been given permission to do the kind of schools they want to do. Because if you look at these same architects, what they're doing in the non-education world, they're doing absolutely amazing things. But in the world of education, they're limited by what schools and school districts will let them do. And we help them push past that and truly bring out the best of these architectural firms. So the only reason we're successful is because of these amazing partnerships we have with our local architectural partners. So with that, this is my contact info, prakash@educationdesign.com. That's my phone, which will all be there in the material that you get anyway. So Matt, I think I'm going to pass it on to you to take questions. Hopefully we have enough time. And if it goes a little later, Matt has been kind enough to say he's prepared to stay a little longer, depending on if you have questions. Hey, maybe I answered everybody's questions and there's no questions, but we'll see.
No, we definitely have quite a few questions for you already, Prakash. And
should I close this window and go back to the?
Yeah, if you want to do that, you'll be able to see
okay,
the things that are in here.
Okay.
Do you want me to field the questions to you?
Yeah, well, I'll take a quick look while you're would think the bubble options to follow science regarding new content ability to contact race. Yeah, obviously the bubble option, the CDC is looking at it purely from the perspective of, hey, does it work from that perspective? And what I'm saying is this is a far more complicated equation, and we have to take out the social costs of it as well. So that's the reason I have it up there. But to me, as I said, it goes beyond simple answers. So Matt, you can be reading some of these things too.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a question in here from Ariel who says, for many of the options, regular hours that students are in school is changing from pre-pandemic. How does this combine with the needs of families for children to be cared for while parents work, a role not essential to schooling, but somewhat essential to society?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, it's interesting that communities have opened up economies without really even paying attention to this question, right? I mean, people are saying, okay, the economy is open, but schools are closed and kids have to stay at home. So if you have a young child, hey, not our problem, right? And what I'm saying is that we have to look at this now as a much broader problem. Schools have been sort of pushed under the rug and allowed to exist in this horrible place only because children don't vote, right? And so that's why schools look the way they do, because their budgets are constrained and various other things. And I'm saying that this is the opportunity for us to all become advocates for children and to say that we need a social structure in which children are not going to be in school all the time. What happens then? I mean, there are many countries in which this has not been such an issue because society takes care of it. So what I'm saying is, just as when women's rights became front and center, we had to restructure society for that, right? So I think this is a time, this is a very historic time in human history when we can't be daunted by these problems. We have to look at them head on, take those challenges and figure out ways to solve them. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm saying this brain trust who's in this meeting alone, put our brains together, guess what? We probably can solve all these problems.
Okay, our next question and comment is coming from Natalie asking, have considerations been made on student ability to online learn based on their age? And she notes that her 6-year-old had a vastly more difficult time with online learning than her 11-year-old did.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because the word online learning, the minute you attach the word learning to something, it becomes a chore, right? And the bottom line is that it doesn't have to be a chore. A lot of the things that my son was doing when he was young and he's doing now are things that he's online because he wants to be. So if you really took full advantage and you went to the blended model, there are going to be ways in which younger children can be just as engaged, right? We start with the idea that engagement is an absolutely critical prerequisite to being a good learner. And so you start with that and say, if my kid isn't being engaged, then they're not being a good learner. The latest book we wrote actually follows the science on this, which says that learning is actually a byproduct. And the problem with schools is that we made learning front and center. And by making learning front and center, it's counterintuitive, but essentially we have robbed our children of the ability to be good learners. So if we were to focus instead on great experiences for our children, and in our book, we say play, absolutely an amazing learning experience, live, there are hundreds of ways that children can just live. Hey, look, join your parents and help them cook. That's an amazing way to learn. Figure out things that happen in day-to-day life. Talk about charity and figure out why there's inequity in the world, and on and on and on. So live, learn, and then it's engage, which means that whatever you do, do it because you really want to do it and be into it. And then live, play, engage, create. Children are creative. What creative opportunities are we giving them in the online world that they can express their own personal creativity, whether it's creativity in writing a story or creativity in a piece of artwork or doing making a new media out of a photograph, whatever it is. So I think that if you were to focus on student experiences as opposed to a curriculum in the traditional sense, you're going to get kids more engaged. And I think that that's our challenge and how we can do that.
Okay. So the next thing, I'm going to kind of condense it here for time purposes, but someone who's an architect and a parent working from home with their spouse, trying to support the online learning of a third grader. And the comment is about acknowledging the role of schools as a place for daily childcare of working parents in addition to a learning space. And like, how do you feel that fits into the near-term and long-term models of the future of education?
Yeah, I'm completely in favor of the school being a place for childcare, only because right now we don't have an alternative, right? Even in our book, we sort of acknowledged that you're not going to shut all schools down, which guess what we did? We shut them down because we had no choice, right? So now society was put in the awkward position of saying, now what happens, right? And I'm saying that rather than see that as a problem, we need to make sure that schools are providing this daycare type facility, but that doesn't mean that they don't have an obligation beyond that. That's this lowest bar that they have to jump over. Okay, I'm going to keep your kids for a few hours a day. But the second question is, yeah, what are you going to do with them while they're there? You know, are they going to come out of this experience better? Are you going to rob them of the creativity, like Ken Robinson said? Or are you going to enhance the creative juices that were already there in them when they walked through the door? I want my children back in better shape than when they went in. So I definitely feel that the daycare aspect is an important piece, but I think it's a societal problem. And I think society is now verged at a point where we should talk amongst different professions and different fields to try to solve it, rather than make this a problem for only schools to solve on their own.
Our next question asks you, in the blended model, how does a school district deal with keeping students at home for periods of time when many students' parents are at work and there's no childcare available at the home?
Yeah, this is, as I said, a lot of these are questions that we are now encountering because we had built school as a custodial arrangement. We did not build school as a learning place. So now you take away the custodial arrangement, and boom, parents are left with no safety net, right? This is what I'm trying to say. When we knock over one domino, we're knocking over multiple dominoes. So we simply can't say that, wow, we'll throw up our hands and say, well, we can't do it. What choice is there? We can't put all kids back in school. We've already demonstrated that, right? We can't leave them all at home. We already demonstrated that. So we have to come up with elegant solutions. Said, hey, it takes a village, right, to educate a child. So this is a societal problem. Just as we have dealt in the past with social evils that we have encountered, this is not an evil. This is a massive social inequity that particularly parents who absolutely have to be at work are facing. I'll just throw one idea out there. What if parents themselves could be working part-time, and a parent at the end of your block said, I'll be the teacher for the day, you know, and my teaching is not going to be the formal teaching. It's going to be, I'm going to be the caretaker, and I'm going to give students lots of opportunities. And Sugata Mitra basically said, all a good teacher has to do is ask good questions. And I actually saw this model work exceptionally well in Thailand, where a parent who didn't want to send her kids to school just made up a school right there in her backyard, and it worked perfectly. So what I'm saying, there are ways to think about this, that we can solve this problem, but we first have to acknowledge it's a problem and not be so panicked about getting kids back in school, because do you want them to go back to that? Here's an opportunity not to do that. When we know it's failing, let's not just go back to that.
Okay, we've got lots of great questions in here, and just for everyone who's attending, if you absolutely have to go, you know, we're hitting the hour mark for CE purposes, so you can sign out, but we're going to continue on for another 10 minutes or so and just try to go through as many of the submitted questions as we can. And our next one is asking, where does outdoor learning factor into your hybrid model, and in your app, will you consider outdoor learning?
First of all, outdoor learning is an absolute must. Okay, so in the blended model, significant part of those experiences are intended for students to take that, what they learn in the so-called indoor world. And like, for example, gardening, they might watch a video or something, and then they go out and actually do it, right? So that's an important piece. I would say critical. Now you might have noticed forest schools, which were a big deal, are now coming back with a force, because that's all of it is outdoor. And in our app, absolutely, we are looking at every part of the outdoors, and we are designing the outdoors with the same kind of intense attention to detail that we would do with the indoors. I want to address one question here that I think is an important one, because when I show these pictures, it's easy for people to dismiss it and say, wow, that's a more expensive model, right? So I just want to say that the learning community model actually gives you a net to gross ratio of something in the neighborhood of 85 to 90%. What that means is 85 to 90% of the space in the building is actually used for teaching and learning. Guess what? I worked in New York City public schools. The standard they accepted was 65%. That means you could design a building where only 65% of the space is available for teaching and learning, and they would accept that. So you're getting back, for every 100 square feet of built space, you're getting back 15 to 20% of space back. So that's a massive return on investment that you wouldn't have had. So that's just one way. And I want to just talk about one other way in which these spaces are less expensive, because you're creating multiplicity of spaces that suit the activity that's happening. So if I'm a teacher with 5 students, why do I need to be in a classroom, 750 square foot classroom? So I can make the overall building smaller as well, because now the spaces are more suited for the activities. And lastly, no corridors. We're getting rid of 30% of the space that is used for bullying and other antisocial behaviors.
Okay, there's a couple questions along this same line. So I want to address the questions of asking how special education and learning support needs are addressed along with mainstream classrooms in the proposed blended models.
Yeah, that's a great question. As we said, what differentiates special education from the normal is that special education children have something called an IEP, an individual education plan. And what we're saying is that that kind of also becomes a bit of a stigma, especially if you're a mainstream special ed child, it comes with a bit of a stigma. And what we're saying is, if every child has an IEP, every kid needs help in some areas and less help in other areas. And the special ed child is just one more in that spectrum of children who need help in multiplicity of areas. So a kid who might be exceptionally bright in many ways might need a lot of help in the emotional social area. We don't know, right? So what I'm saying is, this is a model that starts with the child and figures out what that child's needs are. And we put society's full attention to bear on that child and say, what can we as a society do to help that child? And especially a child who needs more help will get it. And ironically, by doing that, you actually give less help to those who don't need it. And that's great, because the less help, I mean, Gary Steger, a good friend of mine, basically likes to say, less us, more them. So this idea that there's a direct correlation between teaching and learning is absurd. What we've found, in fact, in studies is that good teachers are ones that challenge students and then step aside. That allows those teachers to then put all their attention and help for the special ed child who might need it.
All right. So the next question is saying, often when we present new ideas that a district has not seen, they ask where they can go and see how it works. How do you present innovation like you've talked about today without having a client say, show me where it's been done?
Well, that's, the interesting thing is, when I started this about 20 years ago, I was working for New York City public schools and had built a bunch of horrible schools. That's unfortunately will stand for another 30, 40 years. But I knew that was the wrong way of doing it. I knew that as architects, we could do better. And I just started talking about it with no evidence whatsoever. But it resonated with people because it was common sense. Why should we build schools that look like they did 50, 70, 100 years ago? So the people who were really pioneers and who really cared about this joined with me. And at that point, we did it on faith. And one of the projects we did in Tasmania, in a very, very, very impoverished community, ended up winning the McConnell Award. And it was the first project outside the United States that ever won that award. So it proves that these ideas work. And it actually changed the whole image of Tasmania as a backward state to what, the governor was boasting about education with this one school. It changed their entire opinion of who they are as a people, right? So what I'm saying is that, and then I didn't have evidence. And now we have hundreds of case studies from all over the world. So yes, if a school district were to ask me that question, I'll say, where do you want to go? Hawaii or Colorado, or do you want to go to the Midwest somewhere, to the Middle East somewhere, or do you want to go to Asia? We'll take you wherever you want to go. And of course, they'll probably pick Australia as a nice place to visit.
Prakash, several of our questions today have revolved around the education and training needed for teachers making
Yeah.
this transition. And I noticed a couple people even saying just like, well, you know, a lot of times teachers are set in their ways and very used to the old model. So any comment or
Yeah.
thought about that?
Yeah, I think that I 100% agree. In our practice, I think we put a tremendous emphasis on teacher professional development. And I think, as I said, the biggest challenge for teachers is to know that giving up control is actually good for the child. At the end of the day, you're becoming a teacher for the most part because you care about children, right? And I think that when teachers have the overwhelming evidence that doing less actually is better for kids and being the guide. I mean, Sugata Mitra, again, in his experiment showed that the best thing a child could get from an adult is encouragement, not answers. You don't need to give them answers. You just need to encourage them, pat them on the back and say, hey, wow, you're doing great. And that's the most important thing. So teaching actually becomes easier when your focus is on process and your focus is on the big questions, and then you're encouraging children to really think through things. And you'll be amazed at the kind of answers that children come up with, given their own, left to their own devices. And we do have measurement tools for that, by the way. That's what the apps were all about. So it's not like we're just out there and hoping for the best. We've actually been able to prove from a neurological standpoint, from a social standpoint, from an economic standpoint, that the process we're talking about will actually graduate students with skills that they need to be successful.
Okay. We have a question asking, what can you say to a school district that is currently building new schools based on existing standards?
I'm sad, I'm sorry, but I can't tell you how many times we've been approached by schools or school districts saying, oops, I wish I'd read your book before I spend this $20 million or $100 million in some cases. The good news is that we were actually working with many schools around the world that actually were in the middle of construction. And they said, well, never too late, right? And in some cases, schools that had just been built. And of course, communities are going to say, you spend all this money on the building and now you're going to change it. The good news is that the changes can be made very inexpensively. And so, it's unfortunate, but I would say that stop now. Don't keep building schools according to old standards. We're going to give you enough proof that it doesn't work. And now you have a tremendous excuse, if that's all you were looking for, to say no more going back to business as usual. Why would I want to go back to that 1.5 when I have a 19 right there, right on the corner? You know, why would I do that? You know, so yeah, I'm just saying that everybody has hope.
Well, this kind of piggybacks off the conversation really, but a great comment slash question coming in just here a moment ago from Meredith, saying that not all school districts are thinking progressively even now. How can we as architects advocate for change with the teachers, school districts, and even the legislatures who create the testing standards that drive so much of the student experience?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the amazing opportunity we have is there's 80 million children right now out there in limbo, right? And it creates a tremendous social pressure to do something about it. And what I'm saying is necessity is the mother of invention. So as long as things were skating along under the old model, we could keep that going. We can't do that anymore. No matter what, you're going to have to reinvent yourself. And the point is, hey, if you're going to do it anyway, here are 3 or 4 or 5 models. This works better than the other one. And we're not talking about models that, remember the blended model I showed you, I said that's a reasonably no cost option, right? So what I'm saying is that it's time to start building those coalitions. And whether you're an architect or whether you're a school superintendent or even a teacher, it's time to bring people to this message. And what we found is that when the message is powerful, it kind of sells itself. And the biggest problem that we've had really is not that people are not willing to listen to our message, is that we're not reaching enough people. That's it. Because most of the people who hear the message say, yeah, we've worked with public school districts in the United States all over the place, and they're bought into it when they realize it works, so it will work.
Okay, we are gonna have to wrap up here shortly, but I will pass along this question from Flora, who is asking if anyone's actually speaking to the major players in education, like the Department of Education.
Yes, I've been speaking to a number of them, and many of them come to me. Our model is mostly one where we put the word out and they find us. I mean, these days on the internet, it's so easy to find. So rather than try to spend my energy trying to convince people, I'm trying to work with people who are already convinced that we need a better way and use that body of evidence as a way to convince other people, because not everybody's a pioneer, right? Most of them are settlers, and that's fine. You don't have to be a pioneer, you can be a settler. But there's this group that would only come in when the first McDonald's is built, right? That's the last group. I'm not trying to work with them right now. I'm saying there's enough people in these other groups that are really interested. And so let's work with them. Let's create enough of a momentum here. Let's create enough of a buzz so that others will follow and they'll just come along for the ride because, hey, we have a better way of doing it. It's been tried, it's been tested, it's no risk. I'm ready to jump on right now,
Okay, well, we've gone over 10 minutes from our allotted time, so I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up today. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. And I did go ahead and put a link to download the materials in the chat window. So you can click that link, or I'll also send an email out to all of our attendees here after the conclusion of the program and get you that link. We've got the slide handout from Prakash as well as a resources list that he's put together for you.
One last thing, Matt, I want to say
course.
that anybody here who hasn't had their questions answered or something woke up in the middle of the night suddenly were thinking about something, feel free to email me and I'm more than happy to give you a very personalized, individualized answer to your questions.
All right. Well, hey, Prakash, thank you again for such a wonderful presentation. I think, obviously so many people wanted to hear what you had to say about this topic, and it was a really great presentation, so thank you.
Thank you again. Thanks everybody for coming. Hope to see you guys in person sometime soon.
Okay, everyone,
Okay.
Your certificate of attendance and evaluation form will be emailed out to you within 24 hours, and we ask that you take a few moments to provide us with your thoughts on the program. You can get registered for more upcoming live webinars over at education.a4le.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.